Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 249 opens up with a flashback, and normally when you hear those words, your immediate thoughts as a reader are, okay, which character is dying in this chapter? Because nothing good ever comes from flashbacks in Jujutsu Kaisen. Most famously how Nobara had her flashback, and then we found out that Mayuto gave her a total makeover by blowing half of her face off. However, Yuta fans can rejoice. Our boy, he isn't dead just yet, but as the Yuta versus Sukuna battle is raging on, there are signs that are showing that Yuta might be in trouble if Angel doesn't have something bigger planned to handle this Heian era Sukuna, who is now gaining back some of the power that he lost in those fights with Gojo and Kashimo in those super exhausting battles. With the flashback in particular we go back a few minutes earlier in the story where Yuta has cut off Kenjaku's head, and we get the opportunity to see the last moments of Kenjaku, which cement him potentially as the best villain in this series in my opinion. He might be headless, but the guy was not without his options and took advantage of the chaos that ensued to begin plotting his final move of treachery, which is while Yuta and Rika are slicing down the cursed spirits that have begun to get unleashed on the colony, Kenjaku's head begins to float away into the air, and he adds a new rule to the culling game, which is the one we saw in the last chapter, to give Fushiguro Megami the power to start the merger between humanity and Master Tengen, which basically means that Sukuna can do it since he's possessing Megami's body. And Kenjaku seems pretty confident that his plan will work, given all super mega vibes of that classic shonen villain trope where they get super cocky even in defeat. He claims that he now has insurance for any situation, and that because Sukuna has already finished the succession ritual from before, he pretty much has the outcome that he wants. It truly shows off how manipulative of an a-hole that he is, but how brilliant he is when it comes to thinking ahead and planning all the way into the end. Granted, when you take that stance, there are things that you cannot account for. That's usually the way that life works. Just when you think you got it figured out, life throws a curveball at you, and that's one of the things that shonen stories often teach us, that things, they don't always go the way that you want when you least expect it, but you have to be ready for the changes and be able to endure the winds of change as they begin to start blowing your way. Yuta sees this and sees Master Tengen reduced to a cursed womb type appearance right before Kenjaku tries to escape, and Yuta adapts accordingly by rushing forward through the air to stab Kenjaku in the middle of his head, right there in the stitches, aiming for the head, and we get another payoff to the ending of Kenjaku versus Takaba's fight, where Kenjaku admits that this time with Kenjaku and Takaba, he's had the most time that he's had for the last 1,000 years. And the reason why I like this is that despite for as despicable as Kenjaku was as a character, Gege still finds a way to humanize the character in what appears to be his final moments, and it makes you appreciate that very wacky Takaba versus Kenjaku battle a lot more now, which I think this is the mark of a good writer. Getting stabbed right through the brain like that, like sheesh, if Kenjaku ain't dead, somewhere Satoru Gojo is feeling cheated for literally having half of the plot armor. Now, calling it down the middle though, because I have praised Gege while I saw fit, I do have to call it down the middle. While I did enjoy this conclusion to Kenjaku's character, I do have to concede if we don't get some kind of Heian era flashback later on, even if it's just 1 or 2 pages, something with Sukuna and how he and Kenjaku met in the past, this might end up being a anticlimactic way for him to go out, especially since we didn't even get that flashback of Gojo warning Kenjaku that, hey, Yuta Okotsu, he was the one that beat up Suguro Geto, and you're using his body, he's gonna be the one that actually ends up taking you out. And you had Kenjaku saying like, yo, you're betting on Okotsu will never be the next Gojo. Since we didn't get something like that, I do have to say this might end up being anticlimactic if this is the last thing we see with Kenjaku. Now, we then shift over to the present time where Yuta is staring down Sukuna, and he's quickly realizing how messed up the situation that he's truly in, because Sukuna's reverse curse technique is finally starting to kick into gear. And Yuta knows that this battle is going to get a lot harder for him now, because he knows that Sukuna will be able to use domain expansion again at some point, which that in of itself shows you how much of a monster Sukuna is. That even after that super epic and intense domain battle that he had with Gojo, and then battling Kashimo in that very epic battle, and then battling against Yuji and Higaruma, he still is able to potentially bust out another domain expansion at some point in this battle if given the chance, which is something that Yuta knows. And we go through another period where he begins to start beating himself up and wondering if he made the wrong decision by going after Kenjaku, and maybe if Maki would have been the one that went after Kenjaku, that might have been a better option. He throws the bad thoughts out of his head and he refocuses his attention on Sukuna, which that is the smart thing to do. Now, what we see here with Yuta is the classic overthinker complex, where instead of going with the flow, they just go over every single detail with a fine-tooth comb, looking for answers to questions that they have answers sitting right in front of them. Would Maki have been a great choice to go sneak up on Kenjaku? Absolutely. She has no curse energy, but as Yuta correctly comes to the conclusion, had Maki been there at that colony, likely it gets wiped out because only himself and Rika would have been able to actually handle that mass outpour of cursed spirits that were flooding the area after Kenjaku's defeat. While this is something that I do love about Yuta's character, it's also something I dislike as well. It's a double-edged sword, and it's actually ironic because he is one of the strongest guys here, and Gojo put a lot of faith in him. Again, he told Kenjaku, hey, that guy Yuta, he's the one that puts you down, but this kid is still in his head a bit, and it does make you wonder, will this come back into play at some point during this fight with Sukuna? Which, speaking with the fight with Sukuna, so far, this is amazing. Yuta tries to get the drop on Sukuna, who quickly makes blades on his palms of his hands to grab onto Yuta's sword, and he then snatches it away from Yuta, but this dude immediately adapts and wham! Hits Sukuna right with a body shot right into the kidney area, right into that mouth that Sukuna has on his body. And after Yuta forces Sukuna to throw the sword into the air off a reflex, Yuta snatches this thing out the air and begins to work Sukuna by trying to land another hit on him and to divert his attention from Rika, who is lurking in the background with a large freak of debris in her hands, and we see Sukuna getting jumped by these two. However, after seeing Sukuna isn't going down easy and knowing that Sukuna is regaining his power as time goes by, Yuta throws down his trump card with the domain expansion that we were teased with earlier in the Colon game, but now we see it, and somewhere Fate Stay Unlimited Bloodwork fans are doing the Leonardo DiCaprio finger pointing meme, basically because this looks like it's a cross between what we saw with Archer and Shiro, Emiya's battle, and Byakuya Kuchi in Bleach with his Bankai, which if I had to guess, it'd probably be the latter that inspired it, because JJK's mangaka Gege has openly talked about Bleach inspiring the story in certain elements. You know your domain expansion is pretty nasty when even Sukuna goes on a defensive for a second by using Hollow Wicker Basket, and we see Okotsu come to the conclusion that everything in this battle will be determined by his domain expansion, which has all these swords around the battlefield that he can use, and given the guaranteed hit rate with domain expansion, Okotsu knows this is his best shot against Sukuna. Now, what's interesting about Yuta's domain expansion is the emphasis on the ring and how it links him back to Rika from Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0. But what's also interesting here is that the ring is on his middle finger and not on his wedding ring finger, which that's either intentional and has a big meaning behind it, or it's something that will get corrected in the physical volume when the manga actually comes out, where corrections are made. But just what we're seeing here, this domain expansion has potential to be broken, and not just because of the way it appears to work, but also broken in terms of the symbolism. This was very well thought out. This thing is called True Love, and he's got the ring that Rika gave to him in Volume 0. And you got the whole knots that you see with the weddings, with Japanese weddings and everything. And you could argue that the ring is like that red string of fate for Kotsu. If we end up seeing Yuta die like this and he ends up going to the afterlife to be with the real Rika spirit, I'm going to be in shambles at the cruelty of this, because it goes back to what Yorozu and Goju said about Sukuna and the whole thing about him still needing to be taught what love is, and how Gojo was saying that his fist couldn't actually beat that into Sukuna. If Okotsu ends up dying and that ring ends up being his connection back to Rika in the afterlife, I'm gonna cry like a baby. Now, Okotsu's domain expansion name was not by mistake here. Again, I think Gege is cooking something up. However, Yuta's domain expansion is also broken in the sense of how it works, and even Sukuna is going to have some trouble with this one when you look at it. On top of having this sure hit effect of the domain expansion, all these katanas that we see, they all contain a curse technique that Yuta has copied at some point in the series, which, Jesus, that is deadly. For instance, one of the curse techniques that we see him use is one of the ones that he copied is the curse technique that Uro uses. Yuta, given all the curse techniques that he has at his disposal, has quite a bit of options to fight against Sukuna, but the downside to his curse technique is that he needs to use these swords one at a time in the domain expansion. Based on what we've seen so far, there is no indication he can swing 2 katanas at once, to use multiple domains simultaneously, or even combine them. If that changes, but as it is right now, we don't actually see that. Now, the problem though is that Sukuna is already beginning to start playing through fighting and figuring out the different pieces, and he's drawing on the memories of Fushiguro Megumi to take in the intel he has on Yuta and his curse technique copy, and looking at the domain expansion to see what their motives are, start thinking about what their next moves are going to be, and Sukuna pieces together right away. He knows that they're hoping he'll have to use Hollow Wicker Basket to defend against the domain expansion, which is basically Sukuna using a version of Simple Domain in a way. And by doing this, it takes away half of the limbs on his body and half of his mouth. And then while this battle's going on with Yuta, he also has to worry about Yuji's new power, which each one of his strikes grabs hold of the soul in an attempt to rip Megumi, Fushiguro, and Sukuna apart, which confirms something that we thought about before, that Yuji's power is some type of soul manipulation to a degree, because when Yuji hit Sukuna, he did vibrate and he did look affected by it. And we're basically seeing this as a plan all along for how they want to save Fushiguro. And Sukuna, despite getting backed up into a corner, manages to talk some trash to Yuji, saying that he's glad he's still got a role to play in all this. But I will say this right here. Given Yuji's power, I think Nobara fans, you gotta be in the mud right now. This is like the final death nail for the character, because there's no point in her coming back now. But I do have a question though. Sukuna right now is almost at full power in the sense that he's 19 finger Sukuna, but Gojo did hide one final finger somewhere. That is a Chekhov's gun that we have not seen used yet. And you have to think that even after Yuji manages to split Sukuna and Megumi, that final finger is gonna have a role to play in some kind of way. The only question is how. I do think, on the other hand, giving us the fan service of Yuji and Yuta working together, that was a super smart idea, because it gives us the chance to see the original main character Yuta teaming up with the current main character Yuji to battle alongside each other. And you have to think that when you add in the Rika factor and potentially Maki being out there somewhere, they got some really nasty combo attacks they can use to pressure Sukuna. If you throw in Hakuri, since Hakuri is getting upscaled because of what you see here with Yuta, this has potential to be really crazy, and I'm so excited to see how the next chapter plays out.